From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. In a packed hall at the World Economic Forum, in front of an audience of global leaders waiting with bated breath, President Trump addressed the issue everyone wanted to hear about: Greenland.
Big, beautiful piece of ice. It's hard to call it land. It's a big piece of ice.
But even here at Davos, it was clear that Greenland wasn't the only place or the only ice that are preoccupying the president's thoughts.
And then ice gets beat up by stupid people from leadership in Minnesota. We actually are helping Minnesota so much, but they don't appreciate it. Most places do. You know, Washington, D.C. is...
Since the killing of a local woman, Renee Good, on the 7th of January by an ICE agent, thousands of Minnesotans have taken to the streets in protest.
You can feel the presence of a militarized force in our city that feels dangerous. It feels unpredictable. It feels like a tinderbox.
2,000 more ICE agents have been ordered onto the streets of Minneapolis and tear gas is being used. But President Trump is blaming the protesters for the disorder.
These are professional agitators and professional people that want to see our country do badly. But that's not happening because we have the hottest country anywhere in the world, despite this stuff.
The mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, has condemned ICE, telling them to get out of his city.
We do not want you here. People are being hurt. Families are being ripped apart. Long-term Minneapolis residents that have contributed so greatly to our city, to our culture, to our economy are being terrorized, and now somebody is dead.
So why has Minneapolis become a hotbed for national tensions? How did ICE become a deadly tool of the Trump administration? And is America turning against this army of immigration enforcers? The story today: has ICE become Trump's private army?
It's very, very cold. I got there quite late in the evening, around midnight, on the street where she was killed.
That's Will Pavia, New York correspondent for The Times. He went to Minneapolis after Renee Nicole Good was shot dead by an agent from ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
And people were building barricades. It felt like a whole neighborhood was sort of coming together, trying to help in whatever way they could. People were bringing logs, people were bringing coffee and food for the people who were protesting. And there was just a general sense of sort of stunned shock. And people talked about George Floyd's death and what the city had been like then.
Because Minneapolis is a city that knows protests.
Exactly. George Floyd was actually killed about a mile from where Renee Nicole Good was shot dead. And that place where he was killed became a sort of square for protests, and it was, closed off to traffic. And so they were sort of doing a similar thing on this street, which is in a sort of very residential neighborhood. And so there were people I spoke to who remembered driving home from work and just seeing the city burning because those protests over George Floyd in Minneapolis turned violent, and were worried that that would happen again. And then there are also people who were just furious and were sort of saying, this is not America when someone can do this.
How big are the protests at the moment? We keep seeing footage where, to be honest, it looks a bit like a war zone. There are windows being smashed, tear gas being deployed. How bad has it got?
So we had these ICE officers who were operating out of a federal building near the airport called the Whipple Building. And so the protests would start every morning outside the Whipple Building, which is a sort of huge grey concrete building. And people would sort of stand on the ice. The first day that I went to one of these, there was probably about 1,000 or so people. And met in the middle of the road outside the building by a long line of ICE officers, all masked and holding these paintball guns and sort of just standing there in the middle of the road. It felt like a real sort of standoff, a confrontation. There were a couple of times when tear gas was deployed and people were arrested, and the protesters were trying to log the cars coming out of the ICE facility and register number plates and so on, so that they could try and keep track of which cars were ICE cars. It's a very strange thing because there's these guys essentially in masks and you don't know who they are. And there's been a whole sort of movement for police reform in the US, which means that people now wear body cameras and, you know, they have their name on their shirt. And that's not the case at all with these ICE officers. So yes, it certainly felt like a very sort of tense standoff.
You describe, people coming across ICE agents, often masked, not much identification, even while they're out shopping for groceries. I mean, has that led to just a sense of being watched almost? I mean, is it an uncomfortable place to be, even aside from the protests?
There were some restaurants that just closed. And then there were people who told me that they now would drive their neighbours to work so that their neighbours weren't picked up on the way because their neighbours might be subject to an ICE deportation. This huge force, I mean, much larger than the Minneapolis police force, was suddenly sort of in the city performing these raids. There was just this very uncomfortable sense of you didn't know where things were going to happen next. And the schools were closed the first day that I was there because there'd been an ICE raid outside a high school called Roosevelt. And because of that, the school district just decided to close for the rest of the week. So it was having a real effect on people's lives.
Well, to understand how we've got to this point, how we've got protests on the street and, a sense of almost a civil war within Minneapolis, take us back to the start of this year. How did ICE suddenly become such a presence on the streets of Minneapolis?
So in early December, Donald Trump starts talking about a huge social services fraud that took place in Minneapolis. Now, this was actually prosecuted quite a while ago, and it largely involved these sort of charities, particularly during the pandemic, and many of them were run by Somalis, or Somali Americans, I should say. And the Justice Department was investigating it once again, and it sort of became a cause célèbre among conservatives. So Trump announces, and the Homeland Security announced that they are going to deploy a big surge of ICE officers to Minneapolis. And part of the justification seems to be that they're going to be sort of helping to tackle fraud. There's this sort of narrative within the Trump administration that undocumented immigrants are somehow involved in a crime wave in Minneapolis, which the federal government is going to arrive to clean up.
As we were discussing earlier, there was clearly a sense for many Minnesotans that this was quite uncomfortable, this sudden presence of ICE. Just describe what was happening around the 6th and 7th of January in the run-up to the killing of Renee Nicole Good.
So in Minneapolis, the response is people are protesting. You see all these videos, people are taking of ICE raids, and people are going out onto the street with whistles. All these groups have organised, they've all done these little training sessions on how to monitor ICE activities and how to do it safely. So people are following ICE officers often, and they are blowing their whistles when it seems that ICE officers might be in a neighbourhood to try and warn people of their presence. And so, as far as we know, Renee Nicole Good and her wife, Rebecca, they dropped their 6-year-old at his elementary school, and they are on their way back from that when they see this apparent ICE raid taking place, this ICE activity, and Renee Nicole Good pulls over sideways in the road in front of the convoy of ICE vehicles, and her wife, Rebecca, gets out and she's sort of blowing her whistle and filming.
It was filmed. The entire incident was filmed. A lot of people will have seen a version of that video, and yet there's still quite a lot of debate over what happened. What do we now know from analysis of the video and all the other evidence? What do we now think happened?
So I spoke to actually a neighbour who came out of his house because he thought he was getting a delivery. He could hear horns beeping, and he said that Renee Nicole Good was in the road sounding her horn, And it seems as if the ICE officers pulled up sort of in the road. It's quite a wide street, and she's blocking about 2 lanes of it. And she gestures for a car to drive past, which may have been not an ICE vehicle, I suppose. And that car pulls away. And then ICE officers get out of the car. One of them, an officer named Jonathan Ross, gets out and he's filming on his phone. And he walks around the car. And as he comes around, she has her window open, Renee Good, and she says, "It's okay, dude, I'm not mad at you," or words to that effect.
That's fine, dude. I'm not mad at you. Show your face.
And he walks around the back of the car and he's filming her license plate. And he's followed by Rebecca Good, who is sort of filming the license plate. And she says, "We don't switch our license plates all the time. It's okay. It'll be the same when you come and talk to us later."
Okay, we don't change our plates every morning, just so you know. It'll be the same plate when you come talk to us later. That's fine.
There's a common conception among the protesters that they believe that the ICE officers are changing their plates or trying to obstruct them to make it harder for them to follow. So he's filming the number plate, and then he walks around and she's kind of, riling him up a bit, sort of saying, "Go and get lunch, big boy."
You want to come at us? I say go get yourself some lunch, big boy.
She makes a gesture with her hand, and then she turns to try to get in the car. But on the other side of the car, another ICE officer has approached the car and has said, "Get the F out of the car." And Rebecca says, "Drive, baby, drive." And by this point, Jonathan Ross has moved around to the front of the car and he's filming into the car. And she can be seen turning her wheel to pull away. And as she pulls away, he shouts, "Whoa." And it's not clear if he's sort of nudged or clipped by the car as it pulls away. But as it pulls away, he opens fire through her windscreen and then through the door, through the open window, at her as she's driving off down the street. You then see the car accelerate and crash into a car and then into a lamppost where it comes to rest on the street, and she's been killed.
And in the video that records those few minutes, you can hear some shouting and swearing.
Get out of the fucking car. Get out of the car. Whoa.
It's a really haunting moment, and it's amazing, rather like the George Floyd killing, for being filmed all the way through. People can see it, and yet there are so many different interpretations of what happened. Just talk us through how the Trump administration are describing that killing.
So the first you hear is from Kristi Noem, and she says, who is the Homeland Security Secretary, and she says that Renee Good was a domestic terrorist who was trying to interfere in ICE operations, was killed by an officer who thus protected the lives of others by shooting her.
If you look at what the definition of domestic terrorism is, it completely fits the situation on the ground.
And you get the same line, more or less, from senior officials. J.D. Vance, the vice president, says that the officer was in fear of his life and opened fire and thought that she was going to ram him.
You have a woman who aimed her car at a law enforcement officer and pressed on the accelerator. Nobody debates that. I can believe that her death is a tragedy, while also recognizing that it's a tragedy of her own making and a tragedy of the far left who has marshaled an entire movement, a lunatic fringe, against our law enforcement officers.
And so that's sort of the line from the government, that this was a completely justified shooting by an officer who thought he was going to be run over.
There's a very different version circulating, which is supported by the mayor of Minneapolis and by the governor, Tim Walz. Tell us how they see it.
At the same time, you have them looking at these videos, which, seem to show that she's turning, that she's trying to pull away. And they say, this is nonsense. This woman was shot. I mean, people talk about her being executed, essentially, in her car. And so the first day, they give these press conferences where the mayor says, "Get the F out of Minneapolis."
This was an agent recklessly using power that resulted in somebody dying, getting killed. To ICE, get the fuck out of Minneapolis.
And I think that's on the Thursday. On the Friday, the agent's own cell phone footage is released. And J.D. Vance actually tweets it and seems to think that it's exculpatory. He sort of says, it's proof that this agent was being harassed and that, that he was within his rights to open fire. I mean, anyone who looks at that video, I watched it at the time and I was astonished that they thought that this somehow cleared up the case because, not only can you see that he's opening fire as she seems to be pulling away, but you then hear what seems to be him saying, effing bitch, as she drives, as the car shoots away. So it doesn't look exculpatory to a lot of people, I would say. And it was another one of those sort of split screen moments where some people see a completely unjustified shooting of an unarmed woman who's just dropped her child off at school. Meanwhile, you have President Trump and you have J.D. Vance and you have senior officials saying, no, this lady is essentially a domestic terrorist who might have run down this officer and he was in fear of his life and quite well within his rights. You see a lot of comments on social media from Trump supporters saying something along the lines of, F around and find out. In other words, she was messing around with the ICE agents. She was blocking the road. That's what happens if you start doing that with armed officers.
Wow. So America is no longer a country that welcomes protest, clearly. It is amazing that people can watch the same footage and have totally different opinions of what happened. Will there be a formal investigation to determine what actually did happen?
I mean, it doesn't look like it at the moment. It's quite amazing, really. But initially, you have the Justice Department, the FBI investigating. We then hear from the federal government that actually there won't be an investigation, I think from Todd Blanche. And, there may be a sort of internal review of some of this use of force, but there won't actually be a sort of investigation into how this woman died. There'd normally be a civil rights investigation by the federal government, which would sort of look at whether, she was unjustly killed.
Yeah, and that none of that's happening.
It doesn't look like it.
You mentioned sort of how some of the locals you spoke to felt about it. I mean, you managed to get there quite soon after the killing. Just tell us about the mood. What were people telling you about why they were going out to protest?
So, a mix of things, but people thought it was a historic moment. They thought they were right on the cusp of history, and this was not just for Minneapolis and Minnesota, but for the whole of the United States. They were standing up to an authoritarian government. It was what a lot of them thought. And they also thought that they could help by just obstructing in any way that they could. I was talking to a young guy in particular, a guy called Luke Thompson, who's a electrical engineering student. Him and a couple of guys, they were sort of saying, look, the more that we're down here, the more that they have to come out on the street, the less that they're doing raids and immigration things, the more we're gumming up the works. That was what a lot of the protesters wanted to do. What's the end goal for you?
Bring attention to it, take up their resources. I mean, obviously, they have to spend time and money on us that they can't then spend on taking people out of the streets. And it slows them down a little bit.
And what's happened since then? Because the president actually ordered even more ICE agents, 2,000 more ICE agents onto the streets of Minnesota and Minneapolis in particular, as of last week. How is that playing out?
Well, it seems to be ratcheting up the tensions even more. I mean, normally when something like this happens, you'd sort of expect the government, the police force, whatever, to sort of do its very best to de-escalate. That doesn't seem to be the case here.
In the last few days alone, we've seen American citizens being dragged from their homes and their underpants and their underwear. And there was even a 5-year-old boy detained. I mean, tell us how the ratcheting up in Minneapolis is actually looking.
I mean, I don't think it's polling well. The video of Renee Good, it's one of those rare moments in recent American history and politics where something just breaks through and nearly everybody has seen it. And majorities of Americans say that ICE is not operating as it should. And I just think these videos, I mean, you mentioned that the 5-year-old boy being picked up and according to reports being essentially used as bait to detain a parent and then being swept up and taken off to Texas.
To a totally separate state.
Yes.
There are pictures of him, and he looks like sort of any other 5-year-old wearing a very sweet hat. It's hard to feel like this is really going after criminals.
it just looks very heavy-handed. And, you know, the sight of people being dragged, people being arrested, and people are posting on Facebook accounts of, you know, I spent 8 hours in the federal building and there was no apparent reason for my arrest. And it was complete chaos in there. The officers didn't seem to know where they were doing. And then I saw these great big holding cells filled with people who didn't know where they were going. And, you know, so it doesn't look like a winning message, I would think, for the midterms. And, you know, it raises all these questions. You know, the basic message of many of the Minneapolis protesters, this is not America, what is happening to America, is breaking through. And, you know, you had Joe Rogan, the podcaster, on his podcast saying these people look like Gestapo agents.
You can also see the point of view of the people that say, yeah, but you don't want militarized people in the streets just roaming around, snatching people up, many of which turn out to actually be U.S. citizens that just don't have their papers on them. Are we really going to be the Gestapo? Where's your papers? Is that what we've come to?
He was a supporter of Donald Trump. He has an enormous audience. You know, he interviewed Trump just before the election. You could almost make a case that, you know, huge numbers of young men voted for Trump because of Rogan. And him saying, no, this doesn't look good to me, I think that's an interesting sort of inflection point, perhaps.
Well, to understand how we've got to a point where tensions are boiling over, protests, ICE agents fighting protesters on the streets in Minnesota, I suppose we've got to go back in time, really, and understand ICE, understand where it's come from and why and what it does. So just give us a bit of a briefing on why it was set up, when it was set up, and what exactly its role is.
So after the attacks of September the 11th, one of the sort of lessons that the federal government learns is that we have these agencies who are responsible for immigration, and we have law enforcement agencies and counterterrorism agencies, and they're not talking to each other. You know, we might have stopped this attack if only everybody was on the same page. So there's an act, the Homeland Security Act of 2002, and it founds the Department of Homeland Security. Within that, you have ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is there to basically to arrest people who are in the country illegally and to deport them. It's a federal force. It's sometimes controversial. There are questions about how it operates, but it's a relatively new agency within the federal government.
How has it changed during the Trump administration?
Trump, and particularly his advisor, Stephen Miller, made mass deportations part of their campaign pitch. At the time, I think they were saying they wanted to deport 10 million people, and people said, you know, this is going to be a incredibly disruptive, difficult thing to do. They go on a hiring spree to hire new ICE officers who are going to be the sort of point of the spear for this mass deportation effort. And these adverts are very like your country needs you, sort of, you know, almost like kind of old patriotic wartime adverts.
You took an oath to protect and serve, to keep your family, your city safe. Join ICE and help us catch the worst of the worst. Drug traffickers, gang members, predators. Join the mission to protect America.
There's also sort of suggestions that the people that they're hiring are big Trump supporters. It was reported that the training that they received was 47 days, which is obviously Trump is the 47th president.
Doesn't sound like the best reason.
The Homeland Security Department has put out these things saying, you know, we're following the normal rules and we're doing the normal training, but you have the sense of this huge surge trying to recruit people as quickly as possible. Trump passes the big, beautiful bill. It's called One Big Beautiful Bill, which triples their funding. And so they have a lot more money to do this. I think they said in January that they'd hired 12,000 officers, which is quite a lot in,
wow.
You think, like in the space of just about a year. And these officers are going out onto the streets and being deployed. And Stephen Miller has these incredibly high targets for them. And he's coming down on them hard if they don't meet these targets. The supposed justification is they're going to go after criminals, the worst of the worst, and they're going to get them out. But then you see these ICE raids basically targeting building supply shops where they're obviously just trying to find undocumented immigrants working as builders who are going in and out of there.
Yeah.
So it starts to look more like a general sweep. And because they have quite a lot of leeway in terms of, they can arrest people if they have reasonable suspicion that they're in the country illegally, of course, it starts to look to a lot of Americans like they're sweeping up anyone who's not white, which there's a Supreme Court case about this, which seems to uphold their leeway if they have reasonable suspicion to use race as a potential sort of indicator. So it starts to look like they're just sort of desperately trying to arrest as many people as possible. I remember one of the first really sort of slightly chilling ICE videos that we saw was in March, and there was a Turkish student at Tufts University, and she was walking down a street, and suddenly she's surrounded by these guys in masks who don't seem to be in any particularly official clothing, who load her into a car and drive her away, and she's sent to a prison in Louisiana. And the justification seems to be that she's a Turkish student and she signed on to a Gaza op-ed in her college magazine. And so, she's somehow giving comfort to terrorism. I mean, she's since been released, but she was detained for quite a long time.
She's somebody who's legally there with a student visa.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So it seemed like ICE were busy doing things that, Trump was at the same time waging war on universities. And so, ICE were sweeping in to do things like that. But then you also had these mass deportations in so-called sanctuary cities where the police department are not going to help them arrest illegal immigrants, particularly in Los Angeles. You had them in Portland, and you had these protests springing up against them.
Does anybody have oversight over their actions? You've described them as sort of often masked, not really wearing official clothing. Is there anybody who has authority over them, who has any oversight?
Congress has oversight, but Congress is currently controlled by the Republicans, so there doesn't seem to be much of a move to bring anyone to account there.
And the goal of ICE is supposed to be to deport illegal, undocumented immigrants. Is that working?
They say it is. They say that they've deported more than 605,000 people, and they've convinced 1.9 million people to leave voluntarily. One of the problems that the government has faced is that they closed the border very effectively. It was one of the first things that they did. Biden was actually deporting lots more people because more people were coming across the border, which ICE was then detaining and deporting. So now, having quite effectively sealed the border, they're having to go and find people who've been here, in some cases 10 or 20 years without papers, and trying to arrest them. And that's why you're seeing these sort of families being pulled apart, and people who sometimes have got married or have children, finding that there are these cars outside with tinted windows.
It's not just immigrants, it's not just protesters who are starting to feel sort of the wrath of this administration, I suppose. Tell us about some of the criminal investigations that have now been launched against some of the political leadership in Minnesota.
So the Justice Department has said it's opened an investigation into Governor Walz and to Mayor Jacob Frey. And the sort of suggestion is that they have somehow impeding ICE activities, I suppose with their public comments. Walz specifically said he asked people to be peaceful.
Donald Trump wants this chaos. He wants confusion. And yes, he wants more violence on our streets. We cannot give him what he wants. We must protest loudly, urgently, but also peacefully.
A lot of protesters I spoke to said, we're trying to follow what the governor said. But nevertheless, they are under investigation. I mean, I always think that there's a sort of link that the government seems to draw, particularly after the murder of Charlie Kirk, the Turning Point USA leader. He was assassinated. And after that, there was a suggestion that sort of left-wing groups were to blame. You then hear from the government people saying, well, they're encouraging violence and this is exactly what leads to shootings and killings. It's rhetoric like this. So there does feel like an attempt to crack down on protest as well.
And for you, when you hear people like Joe Rogan comparing ICE agents to the Gestapo, and as you've said, Joe Rogan isn't exactly a classic Democrat, what do you make of those comments? Does it feel like an appropriate comparison?
The first time I heard it, I was interviewing Stephen King, and he said, we now have these people in masks arresting people. He said, it's like the Gestapo. It's like, I never thought this would happen in America. I don't know. I mean, it certainly feels at the moment like they are operating almost with impunity. I mean, when J.D. Vance said this officer has absolute immunity for his actions.
The precedent here is very simple. You have a federal law enforcement official engaging in federal law enforcement action. That's a federal issue. That guy is protected by absolute immunity. He was doing his job.
It really felt like this was a sort of a special private army almost that was sort of roaming around the country doing what it liked.
A private army with extraordinary immunity. I mean, how does this end? Do you think America might get to an inflection point where actually even Republicans, even supporters of Donald Trump won't want it?
This used to be the fear of conservatives, that someone would come to your house and take away your guns or take you away. Immigration was a huge part of Trump's election campaign, and presumably he will still campaign on it in the midterms. I do think, though, that a lot of his supporters took him at his word that, they were getting rid of the worst people and criminals and so on. And that was what they were doing. And I think a lot of Americans look less kindly on the idea of, sweeping up this person who works at a restaurant, washing dishes, and has been here paying taxes for 20 years. It's a very strange thing. I was outside Renee Nicole Good's, the place where she was killed, where there's a sort of all these flowers and candles and so on next to a tree. And I was talking to this group of Somali Americans who were young women, and one of them in particular was talking to me, and she said, I'm a chemist. I work at a pharmacy. I have a perfectly normal job. I have a perfectly normal life. I drive a normal car. I pay taxes. I do all the normal things. I'm a normal American. I just think it's a very, very strange thing to be singled out as a US citizen by your president.
That was Will Pavia, New York correspondent for The Times. The producers today were Sophie McNulty, Julia Webster and Olivia Case. The executive producer was Tim Walklate. Sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. Do get in touch with us with your thoughts on this or any other episode. And if you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.